Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Colburn, Director of RAP's U.S. Programs, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on Rethinking Regulation in an Era of Exponential Change. We'll be recording today's session for anyone who would like to watch it later, and we'll send a link to the recording and to the slide deck to all participants in the next day or so. We look forward to your questions during the Q&A session after the presentations, and we ask that you please type them into the question pane on your GoToWebinar control panel as illustrated in this slide. The official portion of the webinar will end after an hour, but we'll all stay on for another 30 minutes for those who would like to continue the discussion. Exponential change is transforming the energy sector. But since exponential is such an overused word, let's be clear about its meaning here. Moore's law is perhaps the best example, reflecting a doubling of computing power every 2 years or so. In the case of energy, that can translate into doublings in an absolute sense, like more installations, in a capability sense, for example, EV range or battery storage, or in a cost sense, such as halving of the market price. How are exponential changes affecting the power sector today? Well, looking at this slide, first, we have a tsunami of data about the grid, especially with the advent of smart meters, synchrophasers, and other technologies that enable us to better understand what's going on and where on the grid. As you all know, renewable energy is seeing explosive growth, and end uses of energy, from electric vehicles to space and water heating, are rapidly being electrified. Coupled with increasing storage capabilities, digitization, and artificial intelligence, the network effects of these exponential changes mean that grid operators have an unprecedented opportunity to shape and manage both system supply and demand like never before. Today, my colleagues will dive into further detail about these trends and what regulators need to know about them. With me are Senior Advisor Jim Lazar, a longtime consultant on utility rate making and resource planning and a rate design expert. Jim is the principal author of RAP's Handbook on Electricity Regulation in the United States and co-author of Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future. Senior Advisor Mike Hogan, who focuses on power market design, renewables integration, and demand response issues in both the US and Europe. Mike is a former private power developer who came to RAP after leading the European Climate Foundation's decarbonization programs. Senior Associate Dave Farnsworth, who advises regulators and advocates on clean energy and environmental policy and regulation. Dave was previously a staff attorney with the Vermont Public Service Board and served as a member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative's staff working group. And Senior Associate John Shenot, who advises regulators on policies that meet societal objectives for affordable, reliable energy and environmental quality. John previously served as an energy and environmental regulator with Wisconsin's Public Service Commission and its Department of Natural Resources. The trends we'll discuss today extend far beyond the United States, of course, so we're also pleased to have RAP's President and CEO, Rich Sedano, with us today. He'll share perspectives on how exponential changes in the power sector are resonating around the world. The first of the changes that we'll dive deeper into today has ramifications for all the others, the rapidly falling prices of wind and solar power. Jim Lazar will start us off with a look at that trajectory and how, as a result, renewables are playing into state and utility power sector planning. Jim, all yours. Jim, I'm not hearing you. Any chance you're on mute? Are we having technical difficulties?
There are no technical difficulties that we can see on our side. Jim, if you can hear us, can you please log back in quickly? Ken, should we potentially move to the next speaker until we can get Jim back on?
I think we should move to Mike indeed. Mike, let's move to yours. We might need
computer audio. Am I being heard now?
There we have Jim. Okay. Jim, Mike, we can hear you. Let's go right ahead as soon as we get the slide back.
So the cost of renewable energy has been falling and falling fast. The solar, next slide. The solar cost declines have equally affected small and large systems. They continued into 2016 with residential costs down from 2000 by 2/3 to $4 a watt, and the large non-residential systems, the Walmart and Costco size systems, down to $2 a watt. Next, the solar declines in 2017 continued. By the third quarter of 2017, residential systems were under $3 a watt, and utility scale systems broke the $1 a watt installed cost threshold. Wow. Wind is a similar story. Between 1980 and 2012, wind costs declined from 50 cents a kilowatt hour to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But wait, there's more. Bloomberg New Energy Finance reported the best deals worldwide in 2015 on an unsubsidized basis without tax benefits. About 6 cents for solar in the United Arab Emirates and 4.5 cents for wind in the United States. By 2016, Bloomberg reported 2.7 cents for solar in Mexico and 3 cents for wind in Morocco. Then came 2017. 1.79 cents a kilowatt hour for solar in Saudi Arabia and 2 cents for wind in India. But it comes home to the United States. Xcel Energy in Colorado just reported in December the results of their all sources competitive bidding. This was not a one-off result. 238 projects totaling almost 60,000 megawatts. Capacity at attractive prices, energy at attractive prices. I'll focus in on just two of these, the solar and wind bids. $30 a megawatt hour, 3 cents a kilowatt hour for solar. $18 a megawatt hour, under 2 cents a kilowatt hour for wind. This is really cheap. How cheap? Let's compare this to the operating costs of traditional power plants. USEIA publishes the variable operating costs of different types of power plants on a national average basis. In 2016, coal cost an average of $37 a megawatt hour just for fuel and operating costs. Gas was a little lower at $30 a megawatt hour, and nuclear cheaper still at $25. But these are averages. About half of the generating units cost more than these averages. Those units are at grave risk of becoming economically obsolete. Let's put these side by side. So what does it mean? Wind is coming in at less than the fuel costs alone for coal and gas. Solar for less than the operating costs of coal and gas. A utility that has plenty of capacity should still consider buying wind in order to reduce fuel costs. Now, the Xcel bids are not a unique result, although Colorado does have some of the best solar and wind conditions in the country. AEP has requested approval for the Wind Catcher project in Oklahoma that would deliver power to their system for under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And the electric utility in Mexico recently contracted with ENEL of Italy for solar at 1.77 cents a kilowatt hour. Wow, again and again. This is a seismic change in the cost of new resources. If new renewable units can be built and operated for less than the cost of operating existing power plants, utilities acquire clean power and reduce customer bills. It will have important implications for resource planning, for system operations, and for retail rate design. And it will have important impact for wholesale market design, which my colleague Mike Hogan will discuss next.
Thanks very much, Jim. As Jim indicated, the rapidly falling cost of renewables has huge ramifications for power markets around the world. With renewables flooding the grid, power markets will need to better communicate the need for and value of flexible resources. Mike Hogan will tell us more about that shift and highlight growing opportunities to shape energy demand and related services. Mike.
Thank you, Ken. Jim has brought us up to date on what's coming at us, and fast. I'm going to spend a few minutes running through some of the ways this will shift the locus of value on the power system and how it will or should reshape the way we remunerate investment. The key points I will be making are, first, that flexible services will increasingly move to center stage in the power system. Second, that a greater range of such services is going to be required. Third, that this will require shifting money from capacity remuneration to remuneration for energy and services. Fourth, that this should take place in ways that amplify real-time prices to better reveal the value of flexible resources on both the supply and the demand sides of the market. And finally, that as a result, commercial and industrial customers and retail aggregators should begin to see more opportunities to reshape the demand curve in response. A good place to start in thinking about this is to look at whole systems that are already seeing the sorts of conditions we can expect to see elsewhere sooner rather than later. Ireland is one of those systems. It's an islanded system with approximately 5 gigawatt peak demand that is seeing a significant number of hours in which 60% or more of demand is met by non-synchronous sources, the bulk of that coming from variable wind generation. The Air Grid Group, the combined system operator, has been on the forefront of efforts to adapt their synchronized AC bulk power system to provide reliable, affordable service under these circumstances. What Air Grid are seeing is summarized here. On the left, a shift from significant variable production costs to low or even zero variable production costs. On the right, an equally important shift from a system in which the principal value of bulk supply resources lies in their raw capacity to produce energy to a system where their principal value will lie in their capabilities to provide a range of energy services. These shifts in turn give rise to two emerging trends in investment and remuneration. One, that the value of investment can no longer be measured simply in the capacity to produce energy. And two, we will have to bury once and for all the misconception that the marginal cost of energy is always the short-run production cost of the last scheduled generator. A similar development can be seen in Texas, another islanded system adjusting to a large and growing share of production coming from variable non-synchronous sources. In response, ERCOT last year proposed an expanded slate of ancillary services to their Public Utility Commission. That proposal was rejected, but the direction is crystal clear, and ERCOT will undoubtedly be back before long with a revised proposal. The direction was summarized in September of last year by an ERCOT market executive who said that the new resource mix will change both the need for ancillary services and the capabilities of resources providing ancillary services. This has implications for pricing. In some advanced U.S. markets, we're seeing a shift in emphasis from capacity schemes to what I'll call a more three-dimensional approach to the formation of prices in the energy market. This is one example from MISO of the convergence of the demand for new ancillary services, in this case a multi-interval ramping product, with energy market pricing that more closely reflects the actual marginal cost of energy. In this case, what's referred to as extended locational marginal pricing. Among other things, the key idea here is that the best way to reveal the value of and incentivize investment in the needed flexible resources is to ensure that energy prices fully reflect the combined real-time demand for energy and services and the marginal costs of all measures available to meet that demand, including responsive loads. Here's an illustration of what I'm referring to. This is a typical day with the infamous duck in California, showing the net load hour by hour through the course of the day and California ISO's provision of the balancing services needed to comply with an important NERC reliability standard. Keep in mind that Cal ISO has a comfortable surplus of generating capacity, and that during all of these hours, California ISO was well capable of meeting the demand for energy with relatively low production cost resources. So prices should be dropping to near zero, right? Wrong. During many hours, California ISO was well short of the sorts of resources needed to meet both the demand for energy and the demand for flexible balancing reserves. Despite having ample supplies of generating capacity, and despite scheduling resources with very low production costs, the true marginal cost of energy was the opportunity cost of using scarce, flexible resources to produce energy instead of positioning them to provide critical services, a scarcity that increasingly could also be addressed by responsive demand, as long as prices fully reflect the value of doing so. This is one of a number of analyses showing where this can take us in wholesale market economics. In this case, an analysis by Denmark's largest power company of price duration in the Northern European system. From 2015, when prices were depressed by oversupply and a failure to properly price energy, to a future system with 70% of energy coming from low and zero production cost resources, what we see is not a trend to even lower and flatter prices, but instead to healthier and more variable prices that reveal the value of flexibility and reward the long-term value of investment in needed resources. In particular, wholesale pricing can and should reveal the full value controllable loads can provide by reshaping the demand curve in response to less controllable supply, as Dave Farnsworth will cover next. The key is pricing that properly rewards those who are able to balance supply and demand most effectively in the power system of the not-so-distant future. With that, I'll hand the stage back to Ken to introduce Dave Farnsworth.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks for that presentation. The fast-moving changes in markets that Mike described means that utilities and regulators will benefit from taking steps now to ensure that electrical loads are as flexible as possible. As Mike indicated, Dave Farnsworth will now tell us about some tools available to help make that happen, and in particular, the beneficial electrification of energy end uses. Dave?
Thanks, Ken. Good afternoon, everybody. As Ken mentioned, new and innovative technologies putting traditional energy users in a much more active role. And also, as Mike noted, flexible resources can now be found on the supply and the demand side. What I'm going to do is talk about these new end-use technologies and the benefits they can provide the power grid due to that inherent flexibility. Some consider electrification simply to be adding load. I don't think that's correct. We use the term beneficial electrification, and by that we mean electrification that's developed in the public interest. As you can see, electrification is beneficial if it meets at least one of these three conditions without adversely affecting the other two. It saves consumers money over the long run, reduces environmental impacts, and enables better grid management. Let's consider what kind of load can be produced through beneficial electrification. Because it moves heat instead of generating it, a heat pump, for example, or heat pump water heater can be as much as 3 times more efficient than traditional technologies like electric resistance gas or gas-fired water heaters. EVs as well are on the order of 3 times more efficient as their fossil-fueled counterparts. Perhaps most important, this load is flexible, and this fact alone is going to help change the way electricity is produced and consumed. And because it's flexible and can be moved, it has value. Let's look at an example of a home in Seattle with solar on the roof, that's shown in green here, and uncontrolled water heater load shown in the red. And this is obviously, as the heading suggests, the example of inflexible load. The horizontal axis is the time of day, and the vertical axis is capacity. Now it's easy to spot where the water heater pops on over this 24-hour snapshot. The spikes occur 4 times during the day, and they reflect that water heater coming on to make up for the hot water that's being used over the course of the day. Note that spike between 6 and 8 p.m. It occurs about the same time as the system peak, when everyone else on the grid has come home and is doing things like preparing dinner, doing wash, turning on their computers. Now imagine being able to move that water heating load off peak to another time of day when cleaner power is more plentiful, or when everyone else is sleeping and more power is available and it's much cheaper. So that's a snapshot of an individual home and power use, a load shape for one user. Let's consider a larger grid. What I want to illustrate here is how residential water heating load example we just looked at can be useful more broadly on a larger grid, and how that flexibility can help grid managers to make more efficient use of their systems, enable adoption of greater amounts of clean generation that's available, and save customers and utilities money through more efficient use of the power grid. We're back to the well-known duck curve illustration. Of course, the horizontal line provides, sets out 24 hours, and the megawatts are reflected over in the vertical line on the left. This illustrates the challenge that grid managers have in ramping up to serve peak load, ramping up from the middle of the day and serving that load at the end of the afternoon and early evening. So what can flexible load do? Well, it can lower that peak. For example, by removing that water heating load we just looked at, or discouraging EV charging when folks get home in the early evening. And what it can do is move load into the middle of the day when that solar production is at its greatest. This is a simple management strategy, but it illustrates the results for less need. The results it produces, that there is less need for capacity to ramp up from the middle of the afternoon up towards that peak to serve the load that comes on in the evening. Flexible load can also be valuable because it can help renewable energy production be more efficient and thus even more cost effective than it already is. This is a slide that illustrates the penetration of wind resources in wholesale power markets around the country. Those yellow dots are the penetration rate, and the blue bars represent various levels of curtailment. What you've got is representations from 2008 through 2016. Curtailment, of course, is a nice word for power that's not being used, being wasted, according to some. For example, if you look at ERCOT in 2016, they curtailed over 800 gigawatt hours of wind energy, about 1.5% of the total wind potential in that power grid. The same year, MISO curtailed over 2,000 gigawatt hours of wind power. That's nearly 4.5% of the total wind energy potential there. Across all 7 of those wholesale markets, total wind energy curtailment in 2016 was nearly 4,000 gigawatt hours, roughly 2% of the potential. And wind is not the only renewable affected, although that's what we've pictured here. For example, the Cal ISO curtailed over 230,000 gigawatt hours of solar energy in 2016. The point I want to emphasize here is that if BE can move load, BE can reduce curtailment and the waste of this renewable energy. The potential for flexible load does not end there. Some of this load can also serve as supply, and aggregators have developed business models to take advantage of this fact. This is a map on the right here of the Los Angeles area, and large amounts of batteries of buildings in the Los Angeles area, and the large amounts of batteries in the basements of these buildings that are available in the aggregate to provide support to the grid. Now, they individually charge off peak, and they save money doing so. But once they're aggregated and bidding into the market, they're available to inject power into the grid as virtual power plants when and where they're needed. And they do this in seconds, not in minutes or hours. Aggregators can also make EV charging very easy and produce similar benefits. For example, Con Edison and Fleet Karma have a program that educates EV owners about charging at low demand and low cost times. Participating EV owners plug in what is essentially a cell phone into the diagnostic plug in their car. That reports to them and to the utility where and when the person's charged the EV. The EV owner is encouraged to charge off-peak at low-cost times of the day and low-cost times of the year. In return, the customer is paid for his or her performance, much like auto insurance company will pay a customer for driving well. In this case, that flexible load is moved to low-cost times for the utility, and savings are shared between the utility, the aggregator, and the consumer. As these examples have shown, the flexibility inherent in these innovative technologies, paired with a beneficial electrification strategy, has the potential to produce value and savings for consumers, utilities, and cleaner outcomes for everyone. That concludes my remarks. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions. Ken?
Thank you, Dave. Well, not only is exponential change driving the power system to be far more flexible, as Dave indicated, it also needs to be far more resilient. As extreme weather events become more common and more energy end uses are electrified, grid resiliency becomes more important than ever, and the tools previously used to ensure it may not be up to the task. John Shenot will conclude our panel by discussing some of the resiliency challenges facing system operators and how institutions on the ground are taking steps to address them. John.
Thanks, Ken. Our friends at Utility Dive recently described resilience as the power sector's buzzword for 2018. We've always talked about resilience in the wake of natural disasters and major power outages, so that's not a new thing. But the emphasis on resilience is clearly changing, and it's not just a buzzword. Here's one often cited definition of resilience. It's the ability to withstand and reduce the magnitude and/or duration of disruptive events, which includes the capability to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and rapidly recover from such an event. So that's the word. But what's causing the buzz? First, 2017 was the worst year the U.S. has ever seen for natural disasters. This graphic from NOAA shows the 16 weather-related events last year that caused more than $1 billion in damages. Total damage from these events exceeded $300 billion. And in many cases, this sparked a conversation about the resilience of the power grid with renewed urgency on finding solutions. Mike Hogan talked about the increasing need for wholesale markets to compensate flexible resources that provide ancillary services. DOE's proposed grid resiliency pricing rule was unanimously rejected by FERC last month, but FERC did open a new docket on resilience, and they ordered the RTOs to explain how they define, assess, plan for, and mitigate resilience risks. Although this is an important development, we shouldn't forget that nearly all customer outages are caused by distribution system problems, not the bulk power system issues that FERC has asked the RTOs to address. Cyber threats are the newest factor that is focusing our collective attention on resilience. A recent survey found that 1/4 of utility executives in North America believe there's a significant likelihood we'll see a cyber attack take down part of the grid in the next 5 years. People are asking, how often will this happen? How much of the grid will go down? How quickly will power be restored, and what will it cost? Lastly, today, electric vehicles comprise a tiny portion of new vehicle sales, but Bloomberg New Energy Finance predicts that more than half of new vehicle sales in 2040 will be electric. And similar growth is happening with electric heat pumps for water and space heating. While Dave Farnsworth just explained the enormous opportunities for electrification, we must also remember that every home or business that switches from a fossil-fueled vehicle or appliance to an electric one becomes a little more dependent on electricity for the essentials of everyday life and a little more concerned about the resilience of the grid. So summing up these 4 factors, severe weather, the FERC docket, cybersecurity, and electrification explain why there is growing concern and interest in power sector resilience, but they only tell half the story. The other half of the story is about the emergence of clean energy technologies as realistic solutions to the resilience challenge. The capabilities and the costs of renewable generation and storage are rapidly improving, as Jim Lazar already highlighted. And now, for the first time ever, we're seeing the development of combinations of distributed generation, electricity storage, and microgrids as supplements or alternatives to diesel backup generation. Here you see the first of a few examples we'll look at. We'll start with the U.S. military. This very busy chart shows that the U.S. Army has been very busy with resilience projects. Nearly 20 U.S. Army bases already have or are developing on-site renewable generation combined with energy storage or microgrid capabilities. The base at Los Alamitos, for example, is planning for a microgrid with solar and storage that could power essential operations through a 2-week grid outage. Resilient renewables projects are also being developed at many Air Force, Navy, Marine, and National Guard installations, in some cases at little or no incremental cost to taxpayers. State and local governments are also getting in on the action. A few years ago, Salt Lake City commissioned the first net zero energy public safety building in the U.S. It has 380 kilowatts of solar and backup diesel generators. 30% of the solar panels are wired to provide electricity to this building, even if the grid goes down. And the city is also working with a healthcare facility to integrate solar and storage into its emergency management plans. Duluth, Minnesota has taken similar steps, adding 13 kilowatts of solar with 6 kilowatts and 14.2 kilowatt hours of storage to the city-owned Hartley Nature Center. This building can function when the grid is down, and it's designed to serve as both a community shelter and an emergency base of operations for the city. You can find more about these last two examples, along with a wealth of other resources and case studies on resilience, in a toolkit called Building Resilience with Solar and Storage. This toolkit was developed as part of DOE's Solar Market Pathways project, to which RAP contributed technical assistance. State utility regulators play a vital role in promoting resilience. I'll conclude by mentioning some relevant issues that may come before them in the year ahead. First, they may have to judge the prudence of grid hardening investments. Second, many states have opened distribution system planning or grid modernization dockets. Each one offers an opportunity to discuss and enhance resilience of the distribution system. Third, there are ongoing debates about the appropriate roles and business models for utility and third-party ownership of distributed generation, storage, and microgrids. Fourth, the issue of tariff design for microgrids is getting increased attention. And lastly, this could be a busy year for interconnection issues with the expected rollout of revisions to the IEEE 1547 standard. So as you can see, there's plenty for regulators to do. With that, I'll hand the microphone back to Ken.
Thanks very much, John. As we know, the changes of our four presenters have described aren't unique to the United States. Policymakers in Europe, China, India, and beyond are dealing with them too. RAP has programs in each of these regions, and Rich Sedano will share some thoughts on the exponential change that he's seeing around the globe and how policymakers are responding to it. Rich?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone for joining us today and for your interest in these issues every day. I've been president of RAP now for almost a year, and after running the U.S. program for a long time, and so I've been learning about the India, China, and Europe theaters and how we help in those places. And these exponential trends that Jim Lazar talked about really are absolute. They're everywhere, and they're challenging to plan for because they're changing the way people do their business, changing the way businesses respond to the prices are down, performance is up, and that's good news. Other countries are on the case for how to respond to these potential trends, and really the work for government. There's a challenge here for government to live up to this challenge, to represent what good government stands for, to steward this transition while identifying key interests and securing all of this new value. So other countries are doing work on this. Wholesale market reform is firmly underway in India and China. The Indian states, I think, would give the Western states a good run for their money in terms of standing for independence among the states, and yet, like the Western states in the U.S., the Indian states are seeing that cooperation is likely to produce benefits and to produce the need for engagement in ways they've never seen before. There's significant legislation in the European Commission on energy that's going to affect many things, including the energy efficiency obligations that all of the member states are imposing on their utilities. And China is certainly planning a great burst of electric vehicle activity, and that's likely to produce a great global effect, reducing costs and stimulating demand everywhere. So the task for all is to recognize that the power sector oversight starts with a balance between market and regulation. We have what we start with, and the task ahead is to adjust this balance, to make regulation more focused, to do regulation that responsive to the public interest as well as to the private interests that are participating. And so that means that the effectiveness of this for regulators is going to depend on how we address how companies make money and how we charge for regulated services. What are prices going to be looking like, and what are the business models going to be looking like? And then what's the role of the utilities to implement all of that on our behalf? So with those remarks, Ken, I'll turn it back to you, and we'll enjoy the questions from our participants.
Great. Thank you, Rich. So what does this exponential pace of change mean for regulators? Well, for one thing, it means there's no time to be wasted in getting started, commencing the processes needed to adapt effectively to these changes. During the rest of our session, we look forward to answering your questions about the trends we've discussed and helping you consider how policymakers can best keep pace with them. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll raise questions that have come in for our panelists, and there have been several. One group actually, Jim, if your audio is still alive and well, I would start with you. They relate to what role will energy efficiency investments play in the exponential changes, the transition we're talking about. Will there be markets for energy efficiency as a resource, and what henceforth for energy efficiency incentives? Basically, what's the big picture about efficiency going forward?
All right, am I being heard?
You are.
Okay. Well, probably the most important change that's going to happen for energy efficiency is that there's going to have to be a much more clear focus on what hours that energy efficiency provides benefits. Kitchen lighting, air conditioning provide benefits during the late afternoon and early evening period, which tends to be a period when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, and those savings are going to be increasingly valued. Some things like streetlight savings that happen during overnight hours when wind energy may be plentiful may have less value. So the utility regulators and program evaluators are going to have to pay a lot more attention to when the energy savings occur. The energy efficiency remains our cheapest resource. In many cases, it has a negative cost. That is, the When you replace existing lighting systems with LED lighting systems, the savings and maintenance costs of not having to replace lamps and the improvements in employee productivity from having the right quantity and the right quality of light in the workplace may pay for the entire system. But we'll have to pay a lot more attention to the non-energy benefits of energy efficiency programs in program design and program evaluation. I think there's a very bright future for energy efficiency, even with lower cost generation sources being available. Remember that energy efficiency saves power at the premises, and you avoid the distribution, transmission, and generation costs. Line losses and reserves are avoided with energy efficiency. So the layer cake of benefits of energy efficiency remains quite robust, but it's going to matter a lot more when the savings occur.
Thank you, Jim. I wonder if another of our panelists, perhaps John, if you have thoughts on this question as well about how energy efficiency will play?
Sure. I think the value of energy efficiency for enhancing resilience is underappreciated. One of the first steps in any effort to plan for emergency operations probably should be, but often isn't, to minimize the energy required, the energy to serve critical loads. If you do that, then you can meet those demands at lower cost. You can install less on-site generating capacity, whether it's renewable or diesel, and you can add a smaller energy storage system. So I think that often gets overlooked, and then people oversize their systems and pay too much for resilience. I'd also mention that making our entire economy more efficient will reduce those bulk power needs that Jim just referenced, and enhance resilience at a tiny fraction of the costs that we're likely to see if we ask the wholesale markets to start compensating generators for providing a resilient service.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Another group of questions that's come in relates to states and the fact that what we're talking about here are leading edge changes in the industry, and they'll all affect some states more than others. And do we have any ability to distinguish between what kinds of states will be more affected and those less affected, either by markets or geography or technology or something else? Rich, having run the U.S. program for a long time, I thought this might be a good one to start out with you, complemented by even more questions relating to the same issue. What explains the wide gap in eagerness? Why are some states retarding the growth of rooftop solar and so forth? So talk to us about the states and the differences in impact and opportunity that you see.
Okay, Ken. Well, certainly there's a phenomenon of higher cost states being more open to solutions that will address their costs. Some states look at clean energy resources and see that they're perhaps have lower risk and for construction, price volatility, and see that as a tonic for high prices. There's also a technology forward aspect states, and that might have been accelerated a bit by the smart grid implementation grants from the Recovery Act a few years ago that caused so many systems to deploy smart meters and propel them into thinking about how technology can help the system work better. So places with the technology have had to start thinking about how best to use it. Parenthetically, many states are still struggling with this, but it is a question that's in play, and that's a positive thing. And some places are frankly more carbon intentional than others. For many states, controlling carbon emissions is a matter of policy. It's in statute, and for other states it isn't. And for those states that are looking to control carbon, that really requires an openness to new ways of accomplishing safe and reliable service, including deploying all of this technology. So that's part of it. It's not, some people just say, well, look at the coast, the West Coast, the East Coast are interested in this, middle of the country isn't. Well, that's really not evident. Some states in the middle of the country are very interested in making progress along these lines. I think exposure to these trends are going to, though, be inevitable and coming to really every state sooner or later.
Indeed. Rich, I wonder if you see any difference between vertically integrated and restructured states, the organized market states in this dimension as well.
Well, I think the way things will manifest may be different, but I think it's really a matter of what the policies are in the state around carbon, around technology, and the degree to which prices are high or low. I think we have a chance to see as much innovation in Minnesota as we are in Illinois, for example, both in the same part of the country with very different structures of regulation, but both, I think, interested in making progress along these lines.
Thank you. Thanks. A question, I think, probably for Mike. How will wholesale markets work with electricity prices moving close to zero, driven by cheap renewables?
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, as I said in my presentation in the last couple of slides, it's a misconception that that organized wholesale market prices are necessarily driven down or are set by the short-run marginal production cost of well, the last scheduled generator, and as renewables penetrate further into these markets, that renewables would be setting those prices based on their zero marginal cost or very low marginal costs. First of all, the trend towards lower pricing in some wholesale markets we see today really is only second or third order related to the penetration of renewables, and it needs to be remembered that renewables don't set the market price in almost any of the markets we're talking about. The prices are currently being set by fossil generation. Of course, renewables are pushing some of the more expensive fossil generation out of the merit order in many hours, but it is not the low zero marginal cost renewables that are setting prices. More importantly, however, as I showed in my last slide, and as a number of analysts have demonstrated, a high renewables power system where we have finally had the wisdom to allow, if I could use that term, surplus, unneeded, inflexible generation to exit the market. And we begin, as I indicated in one of my other slides, to price energy in organized markets based on the combined demand for energy and services. And once we factor in the expanded need and the expanded range of services that will be needed, there's every reason to expect that price duration in markets with a very high penetration of variable, very low costs, low production cost or zero production cost renewables will actually be healthier than it is today in many of these markets that are suffering from overcapacity. Not only healthier, but also more variable in ways that will more fully expose the value that controllable loads can provide in increasing the flexibility of the system. So I think it's a widely held but fundamental fallacy to assume that because the variable production costs of renewables are low or zero, that market prices will be low or zero. In fact, it's very likely that it'll be quite the opposite, with the dramatically expanded need for services and the effect that that will have from hour to hour and day to day on a fully robust energy market price that reflects that co-optimized demand for energy and services. There's every reason to expect the prices should be healthy in those markets.
Thanks, Mike. On a kind of closely related question, a couple of questions about capacity markets have come in. One relating to the fact that renewables will typically need something to back them up. So is capacity value important for that purpose? And a second, might capacity markets be a good solution for short-term marginal cost, given that those proper pricing signals are not coming through well?
Well, at the risk of painting with too broad a brush, capacity markets are never a good idea. I do bristle at the term backup. Renewables, so nuclear plants require backup. Every plant that's on the system has planned and unplanned outage hours. Many renewables simply have more of them. And so what is required is a mix of resources, as has always been required. I learned power system planning at the knees of some of the people that were there at the beginning back in the 40s when I started with GE in 1980. And there's not a lot new about this. It's a mix of resources that is suited to the resource base, the primary resource base that's available to energy system planners. And as Jim has shown us, whether you want it to or not, we are seeing the economics of variable renewables barnstorming into the system. And it is not in our consumers' interests to try to hold that back. What we need to do is look at how we adapt the mix of resources on the power system to provide reliable, affordable service. And as I mentioned in my presentation, capacity has never really had any intrinsic value or as on its own has never had any identifiable value. Capacity has value to the extent that it offers capabilities that the system needs. And capacity markets have proven over the 10 years or so that they've been in operation, principally in the eastern U.S. markets, that they are extremely unwieldy tools to accomplish this. Energy and services markets, well-formed and well-implemented, are much more effective at doing that. And what we need are capabilities. The best expression of the capabilities we need, the flexible capabilities we need, can be seen in the variation of real-time prices for energy and services from hour to hour and day to day. And capacity markets do not help that. They actually work against it. So while capacity markets have served a function, and they're obviously not going to be phased out overnight, I think capacity, qua capacity, is a passé notion. And we need to think about what the mix of resources is in a system that needs to take advantage of very low-cost variable renewable resources, and how we adapt markets to make sure that those come aboard. And capacity markets are just the wrong tool for that.
Great, thanks, Mike. Dave, we have several questions on beneficial electrification, specifically things like what policies and technologies do you see as most effective to support integration of distributed resources, or best regulatory methods to advance electrification? Even one from a utility asking what's the best way for utilities to incorporate beneficial electrification, say in IRPs, some modeling and issues and so forth. Thoughts on that front?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Well, I tried to illustrate in my brief presentation that due to their flexibility, a lot of beneficial electrification loads can be shifted, and through policies like rate designs, smart charging programs. These loads, they're flexible, so they can be shifted towards times when there's less demand for electricity, when it's cheaper, away from times where there's greater demand and the resource tend to be more expensive. That's a very important key to this. This enables utilities to avoid energy and capacity costs and to permanently avoid costly distribution system upgrades, defer them at least. That might otherwise be added through uncontrolled electrification load. So that management's very important. And we've seen this demonstrated. The Brooklyn Queens example is a great example. Avoided transmission projects in the BPA footprint and elsewhere. So I think there's an opportunity for utilities to save money and for regulators to make sure they pass on those savings in lower utility rates to get customers to coordinate and to help out with that. So beneficial electrification should be thought of, I think, as a management tool. It's one key policy for getting that thermal electric load into the right times and places on the grid and helping to integrate all these distributed resources that Rich just observed are really tough to and a challenge to plan for. Not only will it help in organizing them, I think ultimately using load this way will be a way to encourage even greater amounts of distributed resources. As far as the best regulatory methods to help advance electrification, I want to quote some regulators here on this, because I think we're learning a lot about this, and I think some of the knowledge is out there and available to everyone. So let me make just two sort of broad observations related to that. The Washington Utility Commission recently issued a policy document on storage, and I quote, "As customer demands and resource options change, so do utility needs, becoming more flexible, granular, and locational." Now we've heard that theme throughout this presentation this afternoon. So the point here is this is not grandpa's power system anymore. It's much more flexible and dynamic, and we have to approach it that way. The second quotation I think is really helpful. July 1989, NARUC's Conservation Committee. The Conservation Committee is the forerunner of the Energy Resources Environment Committee. They issued a resolution in support of incentives for electric utility least cost planning, urging NARUC member state commissions to, and I quote, "ensure that the successful implementation of a utility's least cost plan is its most profitable course of action." Ensure that the least cost plan is the most profitable course of action. So observation number two here is we should recognize that there's a growing availability of low-cost renewable resources, and that there are many efficiencies to be gained by managing the grid and by using consumers and the demand side to do that. So I think that today's regulators can ensure the achievement of these very worthy goals that their counterparts identified nearly 30 years ago, and ensure what's going to be greater electrification across our economy with all those innovations and benefits.
Thank you, Dave. Nice. We're getting close to the end of our time for the formal webinar, but we'll continue on, as I said at the top, for another half an hour. I think just time for one quick one, and then concluding remarks, and we'll go into that second half Q&A. The question I would take for that is something that also concerns us all. And if Jim's audio is still working, Jim, how's all this going to affect retail prices for power?
It's going to have a lot of impact. First of all, we're going to have to redo how we measure utility cost of service. Our traditional measurements of fixed costs and variable costs really are not meaningful. We have fixed costs for wind and solar that may or may not provide us peaking capacity, but certainly will displace fuel costs, which are a variable cost, fixed substituting for variable. We'll need to start assigning all of our costs to the hours in which those costs are providing service. We'll need time varying pricing to replace demand charges. I worked with one hotel recently that was installing batteries in order to shave their peak demand to reduce their demand charge. But their peak demand was between 8 and 10 p.m. when the guests came back to their room after dinner. And that wasn't the utility system's peak demand. With the current rate design, they would be deploying expensive batteries and saving the system nothing while saving themselves a bunch of money. Time varying rates will give them the incentive to deploy those batteries when they're most valuable to the system. Time varying rates will also help to shift loads and by so doing enable beneficial electrification to occur at low cost to consumers. We're going to have to pay more attention to bidirectional pricing. More of our resources will be coming from behind the meter, whether those are generation resources behind the meter, storage resources behind the meter, or ancillary services coming from behind the meter. Customer, having controllable water heaters, air conditioners, swimming pools and spas, and other appliances that can provide the kinds of supplemental services to the grid that Mike described from within the retail system and needing to be compensated in the retail rate system rather than the wholesale market. There's going to be a lot of change to pricing.
Great, thank you, Jim. And on that note, let me just wrap a bit here. If anything's clear from our presenters' comments, it's that exponential technology change is dramatically transforming our power sector in ways that have the potential to deliver lower costs, lower emissions, and more reliable service. The question arises, though, what's the regulatory response? And we have several questions that we can turn to in the next half hour to that regard. Will it help or will it hurt in terms of delivering on that potential and aligning power sector transformation, as Rich said, with the public interest? From our discussion today, it's evident that there's at least three major areas where regulators can get started to foster and enable such alignment. That's in the structuring and operation of more open and transparent electricity markets, in new approaches to rate design and transparency in price formation, and in the business models used to provide clean, affordable, and resilient energy services to customers. Thank you all for joining us today. This will conclude the official portion of the webinar, but as I said, we'll continue for 30 more minutes for those able to join us and interested in further discussion. Thank you very much. Let me continue the second segment then with a question for all of us. There's several questions I have about business models. How will a business model have to change? How do you see the utility business model being tweaked by these exponential changes? How will RTOs and ISOs have to change? Several questions along these lines. This is a question that just came in. I wonder who'd like to take that one first, and perhaps more than one person.
Ken, I'll take the spear, the first spear anyway. I'm sure others will chime in. In fact, I'm sure others will disagree with me on some points. But I mean, I think to some extent you have to answer the question with a question, which is responding to which part of this story that of approaching trends that we've talked about. To my mind, while distributed energy resources is clearly a growing sector and segment and is being disruptive in many ways, I guess call me a skeptic that it's ultimately going to be the big thing that threatens utility business models. I think it's going to be an issue to be dealt with, and for many customers it'll be an important option to exercise. The big changes, really, to me, are twofold that utilities are going to have to deal with, the utility business models, whether it's ISO RTOs or vertically integrated monopoly utilities in traditional territories or co-ops and RECs. One is electrification of loads, of transport and thermal loads, which counters the idea that, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the big challenges to utility business models in recent years has been flat and even in some cases declining load. And certainly distributed energy resources have to some extent exacerbated that. But electrification promises the possibility of stabilizing and reversing that trend to some extent and to the benefit of the overall economy, because of course it improves the energy efficiency per unit of GDP. So the idea that utilities will continue to see some growth in commodity sales, I think it is likely to be there. However, complementing that is the other big change, which is going to be on the supply side. As Jim told us, it's coming at us fast. The big, super big declines, or the really super competitive prices in renewables tend to be in the grid scale renewables installation. So again, we're talking about a revolution on the supply side in the wholesale market. And so what that drives, when you look at those two things together, is that the utility business model for 100 years has been a wholesale supply and transmission system that is slaved to dumb demand. And we now see two trends that are converging and happily converging. One is that demand is getting smarter, and second, we're going to have a supply system that will be less and less able to be slaved to anything. The demand is going to increasingly have to respond to supply. And so we look at what Rich Sedano and others have been doing on advancing the idea of the platform, the service provider sitting in the middle of these emerging trends. And to me, the utility business model, the thing that is going to most fundamentally change the utility business model is that. And others may have different views.
Thanks. Anybody else want to? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, this is Jim. I've got a couple additional thoughts to Mike's. As he said, utilities historically have received power from dozens of places and distributed it to millions of points of delivery. And that's going to change to where the resources utilities need, including the ancillary services, are going to come for them from hundreds of thousands of suppliers, from every electric water heater, every electric hot tub, every swimming pool pump, every air conditioner is ultimately going, I believe, to be a part of how we control loads. And the utility business model is going to have to adapt to that in developing a better relationship with everybody from the appliance manufacturers, so we get smart appliances on the shelf, to the installers and the customers ultimately who are receiving these appliances and able to provide these services to the grid, generally without knowing that they're doing so. If your water heater is interrupted for a few minutes or an hour here and there, chances are you will never notice anything has happened, but the business relationship and the framework are going to have to be there. Because so many of our resources are going to come from small compensations to other people who own things, the utility business model is going to have to move away from in my opinion, from a reward on investment, the rate base times rate of return formula in rate making today, to a earnings model that's based on performance, where regulators will set out specific policy goals that they want utilities to achieve, and that their earnings will be tied very closely to their performance on those goals, and perhaps not at all to their level of investment. And that will be a pretty dramatic change in both the utility business model of earning based on performance rather than on investment, and for the utility regulator that will have to become much more involved in establishing the performance metrics.
Great, thank you, Jim. We have a ton of questions along this vein. One that we haven't talked about yet is when the business model is a little different itself. And John, I wonder if you might comment, or perhaps Jim as well, with respect to how these changes are likely to play out in the situation of electric cooperatives in the rural areas and or public power entities and municipalities and so forth.
I can get us started on that. For one thing, I think a lot of the trends we talked about today are particularly important to publicly owned utilities, to municipal utilities. And And that's because many cities, many local governments, it's in part because cities and local governments have adopted their own clean energy or climate goals. That's one reason. I also think electrification is important to them because the goals they adopt for their communities are rarely confined to just the electric power sector, and the utilities that are publicly owned are often called upon to serve those non-electric goals of their community, such as environmental goals. The topic I touched on, resilience, is also particularly important to local governments because they're the ones that plan for emergencies and the ones that provide, or at least coordinate, critical life-saving services when the grid goes down. So, you know, they're responsible for police and fire services, water and wastewater, and emergency lighting. And so I would say that in the case of the municipal or publicly owned utilities, all the trends we talked about today are front and center for them, and arguably even more so than for investor-owned utilities.
Thanks, John. No place to hide, in other words.
Just one little quick example of that, where a municipal utility is now installing backup batteries at each of the traffic signal controllers in its city. Cooperation between the transportation department and the utility department. Those batteries are there first and foremost for when there's a distribution system outage, so the red lights are still red and the green lights are still green. That's made possible by LED lights that draw 1/10 as much power. And they can install batteries that actually fit in the cabinet. But they're also making those batteries available to provide peaking capacity and ancillary services back to the grid. And as Dave described, dispatching all of them as a virtual power plant on occasion when needed. So those batteries are providing both an emergency services function, as Joe just described, but also a power system support function, as Dave and Mike talked about. So municipalities have some advantages in coordination that single-purpose utilities don't have.
Ken, one thing to add to this is that this is really a call to action to all of the support organizations for municipals and co-ops, whether it's the joint action agencies in states that help municipals with perhaps power supply today, could help them turn the ship in this direction towards more kinds of services that their customers might want. And we're starting to see that in some Midwestern states, agriculture states, where the joint action agencies are starting to do that. And the same with the financing offices that support municipals and co-ops, including the United States Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service, as well as CFC. All of these can be very helpful in restating what best practice is and motivating eligible utilities to move in that direction.
Thank you, Rich. An important point indeed. Another question that's come up that relates to this is what about where there are situations of regulatory lag and that the utility or even its markets might be ready to move, but the regulators are a little slow, or even more importantly, where the regulators are constrained by outdated legislative mandates. Thoughts on best ways to approach those issues?
Ken, this is Rich. I want to just give a shout out to the E21 process in Minnesota, which with, I think, some tacit support from government, but largely driven by NGOs, utilities, and other interests, recognized these trends were coming some time ago and have been working hard to develop reforms that can be ultimately acted on when the government is ready. And there's no reason to wait necessarily for the commissions to be ready to go. However, of course, government leadership is very valuable, and this gives me an opportunity to say that innovation is something that is not really done very well in hearing rooms, but is done very well in more collaborative settings. So whether it's a do-it-yourself collaborative like the E21 was, or one that the government supervises and hosts, as is starting to happen in some states, that's where the real plans for substantive reforms are best hatched.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Regulatory lag, legislator lag? Okay. Plenty of other questions here if not. Good. Okay. Dave, a question on beneficial electrification. Again, the thought is, how critical is real-time pricing to rewarding beneficial electrification, and any thoughts on how ready it is to be implemented? Time varying rates, real-time pricing, dynamic rates. Jim may have a thought too.
So let me start on that, because I'm sure Jim has some thoughts on that. Ken, I think it's inevitable that you're going to see a tension between, individual customer choices and optimal, societal benefits. And I think one way of looking at that is one way of looking at EV charging, I think, is to recognize what rates can do. I think they can be really helpful. And I don't think that the challenges are necessarily insurmountable. And I don't really have a fixed opinion as to just how real-time prices have to be, but I think moving in that direction certainly is a good idea. With appropriate rate design or other smart charging sorts of approaches, that could be a rebate, or that could be the condition of a company providing an EV owner a more efficient level 2 charger, for example. Consumer can save the utility money, and as I've mentioned, the consumer behavior can be coordinated in such a way that allows the utility to manage things along the lines of what we've been talking about here. Regulators, I think, need to be vigilant to connect that value for the utility and the customer through these types of policies. So a policy like rate design can be more or less effective at moving the load off peak, as I was mentioning, depending on the differential between a time of use rate, let's say, and an existing rate. And so that type of flexibility to reflect the benefits out on the grid can create the price incentive for a customer. And, incentives come in the form of carrots and sticks. So a rate design that provides an especially interesting lower cost, let's say, compared to typical rates for off-peak charging could be very attractive to some. But I think you also need to consider that, the sticks side of the carrot, or as Jim sometimes says, making a stick pointed and orange. But what you can do is impose something like critical peak pricing, where you assume that some folks are just not going to feel the that wonderful sensation from a really low EV charging price. The fact is that they're going to impose costs on the system if they insist on charging on peak, and so you impose a peak price that essentially is a high charge, so individuals can be encouraged to conform to these trends that hopefully a well-managed grid, that a utility managing its grid properly can share with customers. And I think any number of different ways to define rates can get the results that the utility is looking for.
I think Dave is right, but some kind of time varying pricing is going to be very important to many types of beneficial electrification. Water heating in particular is going to need some kind of an off-peak charging incentive. to be competitive with natural gas. At current average electric rates, an apartment or mobile home is not going to install an electric water heater if they have another fuel source available. But if they can get a 30 to 50% discount for charging during the water heater during the low cost and we hope low emission hours of the day, then that conversion will become attractive. Real-time pricing is something that I think will be applicable to on an appliance by appliance basis. I question whether most elite residential customers are going to want to pay attention to their prices hour by hour or minute by minute. But their appliances and the aggregators that control those appliances can indeed pay attention hour by hour and minute by minute. And as we get more automation of appliances responding to prices, then the high-use appliances, the air conditioners, the water heaters, the swimming pools, the spas, and the electric vehicle chargers can automatically respond. And where we can make it hands-free for the consumer, time-varying prices that may have a more dynamic real-time aspect to them will make sense. And I think we're on the edge of that evolution. Smart electric vehicle charging is here today. There are a number of companies offering it in different parts of the country. I think we'll see the same thing. We're seeing some rollout of smart water heaters, and I think we'll see the same thing for some of the other high-use appliances. But a time-varying price all by itself should be enough to encourage customers to install an ice storage air conditioner or even a timer control on a water heater. Those technologies are easy to deploy. They're in place in a lot of places now. But the time-varying aspect is critical. The real-time aspect of pricing, I think, really needs to come hand in hand with automation. But we find that when there's technology assistance for customers, whether it's a Nest thermostat or a grid-integrated water heater, they're able to respond quickly and provide the kinds of ramping and other voltage support and frequency regulation services that Mike was describing.
Ken, if I could just add one quick thing to that, and one other dimension to this question, which is, I think it's a matter of equity as well. If I, as someone who is not a retail tariff design expert, watches from afar to some extent, the thing I learned from the experience with net metering and all the joys that went with that experience is that we need to find a way to thread the needle between three stakeholders here. One is adopters, two is the non-adopters, especially the vulnerable customers that are non-adopters, and third is the utilities that have to serve both of them. You know, the utilities that have to serve both of them, as I mentioned, the thing that is going to give them a business model to which they can transition is the potential for additional electrification services. They don't want to kill the goose that could lay the golden egg by slapping prohibitive fixed charges on them. You don't want to socialize the costs of dramatically increasing costs of the distribution system to accommodate the worst possible behavior. And if you do, even if you try to shift all of the costs to adopters, inevitably vulnerable customers are going to get hurt to some extent. So I think that's also an issue of equity and also of preserving the opportunity that electrification presents to utilities that are willing to look to the future.
Great, Mike. Thank you. We don't have too much more time. I want to ask a question of Rich because several questions came in regarding blockchain and transactive platforms and energy. Could you give us just a minute or two on that, Rich?
Sure. Well, this transactive energy is potential to be pretty messy for regulators because, in a sense, it's chaos. It's customers doing business with other customers, and it can get pretty rough. There is a fundamental principle that is at the root of this, very attractive, which is that customers increasingly can choose the nature of the service that they're getting, not only the resources, but a lot of other things, including locally sourced resources. So there's a lot of opportunity here for allowing customers, enabling customers to realize whatever objectives they might have, which we've trained them over 100 years to not have any objectives except to have lights. So to some degree, it becomes a matter of building community. These kinds of things are going to come up from the grassroots, as we're seeing in the Con Edison demonstration in Brooklyn. So peer-to-peer transactions will be enabled if, first of all, the government and the utilities work together to see that this has public interest value, and that means figuring out ways to rationalize the physical exchanges of energy that are supporting a community, as well as the financial exchanges that are going to have to go on among peers in a community, whether they're connected and adjacent to each other, or perhaps are connected through an affinity and are not actually adjacent to each other. So this sort of secondary market can happen with blockchain technology, and the fact that New York and Rev and Con Edison are experimenting with this provides us all with a great opportunity to learn about what's going on. So I think the question really for states is, do you have the following objectives that are important, which is enhancing customer choice, true customer choice, not just about commodity, but about allowing customers to realize service in the manner that they want it, and to let markets, let independent customer actions actually do some of the work of asset utilization, so that it's not just about utilities deciding what's going to happen and regulators overseeing it, but has actual customers have a role in this, which they are increasingly capable of doing. And what we're going to really need to have to make this work is a redefinition of what utilities are, and we're also going to need to have pricing reform. We're going to have pricing reform that motivates efficient customer and market actions, and many of what will be necessary for that we've talked about during this webinar. That's it. Wonderful.
Thanks, Rich. Well, we have just a moment left, and what I'd like to do then, in light of so much of this coming back to the regulators as we've talked throughout, ask each of our panelists to spend 20 or so seconds on what do they think are the highest priority actions that regulators need to focus on for power sector transformation, these exponential forces, and an overall decarbonization. Why don't we go in the order? So Jim, I'll start with you.
I think regulators need to look at cost allocation and pricing to eliminate the focus on demand charges and begin shifting those capacity-related costs into the times of the day and seasons of the year when costs are higher. That will help consumers and the technology industry to produce products and deploy products that minimize customer costs and minimize societal costs.
Thank you, Jim. Mike?
Sure. Look at remuneration for investment and energy that shifts the value from raw capacity to capabilities, procure capabilities from resources over the shortest practical time, so that as many possible providers of those capabilities from whatever source can participate, and we've seen examples of that in markets like PJM, and move towards a situation where even resources that are not providing energy in a given hour are still being compensated if they're providing critical services. and that the demand for the energy and the services during that hour push prices to where they need to be, and such that many hours where there's actual scarcity, even if it's not scarcity of capacity or energy, can drive prices to where they need to be, and get proactive about involving customers in the market. It's not just price and pray, it's price and push.
Well put. Dave.
You know, Ken, I would encourage regulators to ask if they're getting any carbon reduction benefits from the investments that their utilities are making or are planning to make. So a really pointed, if decarbonization is the goal, just a really pointed question of what are we getting for these investments that we're making. If you ask and answer that question, that's a good start. And then you can ask how to reflect and build in those questions into the analyses, the various analyses that utility commissions perform. I guess at the end of the day, if you're out trying to reduce carbon, you really have to ask yourself, where are the cheapest tons? Let's get the cheapest tons first and then just build up from there.
Great, great. Thank you, Dave. John? Do we still have John?
I think the highest priority to meet decarbonization goals is to have goals, or at least to have a vision of what a decarbonized future looks like. And then after that, I would say adopting a broad view of the public interest based, in my opinion, on a societal cost test.
Thank you, John. And Rich, I'll let you have the last word here.
Well, John's right. It's important to have goals, whatever those goals are, and then I think it's important for government leaders to lead and create forums where they can rely on their communities to work together. And I do like it when a government leader who senses that these trends are inevitable, immutable, and need attention creates a sense of urgency that the regulator will act, but that it'll act better if everyone has had a voice. So my colleagues have given everyone a good sense of the kind of things they should talk about. I just hope they start talking.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, panelists. And thank you all for attending today. This will conclude our webinar. And as I noted at the head, you'll get in your email links to the recording and also to the slides. Thank you very much for joining us today. This will conclude the webinar.